Hey everybody, welcome to the Conscious Love Show. Whether you are single, you are in a relationship, or you're healing a broken heart, this show is here to inspire you, to remind you how beautiful, lovable, and amazing you truly are, and to give you the practical tools and insights to navigate from wherever you are right now to the loving relationship that you so deeply want to have. My name is Shane Kohler. I'm a certified transformational coach and trainer with over a decade experience helping people release their trauma and open their hearts to love. I've delivered seminars all over the world, coached thousands of people through my online platforms and programs, and every week I'm coming straight to you with the hottest insights and the best teachers around, bringing you powerful resources and profound conversations to heal your relationship with love, dating, and yourself. I'm so grateful you're here, and if it's your first time, welcome. You can count on me to always show up for you with my very best and a commitment to learn and grow myself so I can serve you to my maximum ability. Thanks so much for tuning into the show. I've got some awesome things planned for you today. So without further ado, let's dive in. All right, so hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Conscious Love Show podcast. Shane Kohler here. Pleasure to be on with you today. As always, looking forward to jumping into today's conversation. I do just want to shout out for anyone who's tuning in here on the podcast itself. I want to shout out that I am live streaming on Instagram again. So it's been a little bit, I took a little bit of a break, but I am back live streaming on Instagram. So any of you who want to join me live on Tuesdays, I'll be back on Instagram every week now. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about sacred sexuality. And this topic came from a recent student in my Inspired Love program, someone who just recently joined. This is what she shared, and I'll just start there and then we can kind of work off of that. But I think a lot of people will relate to this. You know, she shared that in the handful of sexual experiences that she's had in her life, they haven't been particularly amazing. And aside from whatever experiences she has had, that the only real other exposure or education that she's gotten around sexuality has been through porn. And I mean, I don't think I have to tell you, I mean, a lot of you probably know this. I mean, like, the impressions that we get through porn are not realistic. They're not particularly healthy. They're often very one-sided from a male perspective. They're often very much about physical gratification, but they don't represent anything deeper. And as I say that, I don't want that to sound like I have any judgment about it, because I don't. But what this person was asking was, she was asking for a conversation about what a deeper experience of sexuality would look like, right? Like what is a greater possibility for it? And I think it's important to say, even leading into today's conversation, that I'm going to talk about a lot of things. I'm going to share some of my experiences, and I'm someone who's had the opportunity to explore a lot in this realm. But what I want to say is, as I talk about my own growth in this area, and as I talk about what's possible and what can be possible for us in this realm of our lives, I want to be clear that there's no judgment on what anybody is doing or how they're doing it. And I'm not saying that anybody should be doing it in any different kind of way. But what I'm going to get at is a greater possibility that we could all potentially live into in our relationships. And what we experience sexually is a reflection of ourselves in a lot of ways. Right? It's a reflection of how deep we can go within ourselves. You know, when we think about sexuality, or we think about having a sexual relationship, that is really the deepest we can go with another person, right? Like in terms of relationship, at least physically, I think there are a lot of realms to how deep we can go in relationships, but at least in terms of physically speaking, our sexual relationships are as deep as we can go with someone physically. And that's a reflection of how deep we can go within ourselves. Sex is the most vulnerable we can really ever be with another person, the most exposed we can ever be. It's the most somebody can, again, ever see of us or experience of us in a physical sense. And whatever our personal limitations are, whatever our personal blockages are, those are going to show up sexually. again, I think it's so important to say this, and I'll probably say it several times throughout the episode, is as I'm talking about this, there's no judgment. Like there's no judgment to how anybody's doing it or how it should be done. But all I'm talking about is some things that I've learned in this respect. And what I think a greater possibility is from what I've experienced and from what, I've seen my clients experience and from what I've learned just about love and relationships overall. And I want to say this too, like as we get into today's conversation, I want you to notice your own reactions to it, right? Like if this triggers you, if you're like, oh, I don't want to hear this, or if you're like if you have some kind of adverse reaction, like that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But notice even for yourself, like what's that about, right? Where's that coming from? Because that's revealing some kind of resistance that you have within yourself, that there's like somewhere you don't want to go or something you don't want to open up to or something you don't want to explore within yourself. And I promise you, if you struggle even in entertaining or having this conversation, you struggle in intimacy. Like you can't disconnect one from the other, right? Because what we experience sexually is truly a reflection of how we experience intimacy overall. And so some of what I say today might be triggering to a degree. Some of it might rub you in a certain way. You might be like, ooh, I don't like that, or that makes me uncomfortable. But again, that's totally okay. And I totally understand that. But if that happens for you, I just want to invite you to like question, like, what is that even about for you, right? Like what barrier to intimacy is this conversation rubbing up against, and what is that revealing? And then the deeper question might even be, if that barrier weren't there, if you didn't have that kind of adverse reaction to a conversation like this, what might become available to you in terms of the depth of intimacy you could experience in terms of relationships? Because again, I've said it already, but I'm just probably going to continue to say it, is that how we experience our sexuality is a reflection of how we experience ourselves and how intimate we can be with another person. And I think sexual intimacy is one form of intimacy, but how intimate we can be with another person is just a reflection of how intimate we can be with ourselves. So those are some ideas that I just kind of want to start with today as we enter into today's conversation. And then again, I want to go back to the comment that one of my recent students made, is that, she was sharing that a lot of her sexual experiences haven't been great. They haven't been particularly fulfilling. And then outside of that, porn has been her greatest education about sex and in terms of how she's been able to learn or experience it. And she said herself, like, I don't think that's a healthy representation or the highest possible representation. And so what she was bringing up was, she's like, I would really like to understand what a really healthy sexual experience looks like, or what healthy sex is like within a healthy relationship. I'm just going to share some things that I've noticed from many, many clients that I've coached, from couples that I've coached. When it comes to sexuality, I mean, I look at when I was single, and I'm going to share this as a man. And I think it's important to share a little bit of my background too, because I grew up in a culture of men, and the idea was have sex as much as you can, as often as you can, with whoever you can. And I'm not saying that's right. I actually think that's a very wrong mentality about it. But that's where I was brought up in. That, like, my father, my uncles, the other men who were around, the conversation that was had around it. I mean, it was kind of a very crude conversation. It wasn't sensitive. There was no higher empathy or higher understanding about any of this. It was very basic male instinct type stuff. Being that that's where I grew up, and when I got to the age where I was ready to do it for myself, and when even leading into my adulthood, and when I look at my adult relationships, that's what I knew. And I know some people may have had different experiences. I know not everybody necessarily grew up in that context, but for me, like, that's where it started for me. And I didn't really know anything more than that. And so as much as I think I was kind of emotionally attuned in a way that maybe my dad wasn't, and my uncles and the men I grew up around, I think I was a little more sensitive than they were. And I had a little more of an attunement to these things than they did. even though that was true for me on some level, I never lived in an environment where that was fostered, where that was encouraged, where that was where I was able to explore that or understand that. And I think, especially for men, I think women experience this differently. And I say this after coaching lots and lots of women, that I think women have, in general, and of course there are exceptions, right? There are exceptions to every rule. But in general, I think women start out with a much higher perspective of sex and what sex can be than men do. And I think the dominant male culture reduces it to an act of like strict physical gratification. And even again, like a guy like me, who I think I was a little more attuned to that, and I was a little more sensitive than that. And on some level, I did want more than that. There wasn't a space where I could really, it wasn't safe for me to talk about that or learn about that or explore that in any kind of way. Because if I were to say something like that to my dad, I mean, I would have been ridiculed. I would have been humiliated. I would have been called all kinds of names and stuff. And it's not just my dad. I mean, if I said it to my friends, if I like the boys I grew up with, if I were to try to talk about that or explore that, and even though maybe a lot of the boys I grew up with on some level felt the same way, they didn't feel like it was safe to talk about. And so there's this kind of peer pressure where this very kind of toxic view of sexuality is being perpetuated, is being reinforced. And even somebody who would want maybe more than that isn't really safe to explore that in any real way. And I think when we look at porn is a reflection of that culture. I think, today there's a lot of people who are doing some great work in terms of ethical and conscious porn, where they're presenting different types of images and different types of relationships and different types of things that are a little more realistic and a little more empathetic. And I think that's great work that people are doing in that respect. But that's not how it's been historically. Historically, it's been very much a very physical thing. It's disconnected from the emotional. It's disconnected from the spiritual. It's disconnected from I think the real experience that people are having with it. And I think that's true for both men and women, right? I think both men and women feel a lot around sex that they don't really know how to explore or how to talk about or where to learn more about it in any kind of deeper sense. But that being said, I do think culturally, women tend to grow up with a more enlightened view of it. For them, and again, I know there are exceptions to this, but for women, it often tends to be about the relationship. It often tends to be about the closeness that's shared. It often tends to be, I think women, from what I've experienced, largely want sex to be an expression of the love or the partnership or the connection they feel with someone versus just using another person's body for physical gratification. While this is changing, while the consciousness of men is evolving, and that is happening, and that's a very good thing, and I think it needs to happen, I don't think the culture that men in our world have grown up in has really been like that and about that. I want to share, there was a book I read called The Levels of Energy. It wasn't a book about sex, but he mentioned something about sex in the book. And this levels of energy chart, I've talked about it on the podcast before. It basically outlines all the vibrational states that a human being can experience, ranging from guilt and shame, which are some of the lowest vibrations a human being can experience, all the way up to love, peace, joy, and enlightenment, right? And then there's everything in between. So there's anger, and there's neutrality, and there's willingness, and there's courage, and there's all these different vibrational states that human beings can experience. In my Inspired Love program, we work a lot with this chart in terms of recognizing where you are on the chart, where you want to be, and how to get there. Something he said in the book, the book was by Frederick Dodson. It was called Levels of Energy, and it's probably one of the most profound explanations of this chart that I've ever heard. But in the book, he talks about sexuality, and he says that sex can be experienced at two different levels on the chart. The first level is kind of a basic level. It's the level of craving, right? There's a physical need, there's a physical desire, and I'm craving that need or that desire to be met. And that's the first level, right? Is just basically a craving, a desire, and I'm feeding or I'm meeting that desire. That's kind of the first level that we can experience sex at. And then the second level that we can experience sex at is the level of love. And so sex for us really exists in one domain or the other. Most of the world is experiencing it at that lower level. And again, I want to be really clear. I said I'm going to say this a lot of times today. I don't have any judgment about that. I did that for years, right? Like that was all I grew up with. That was all I knew. All my relationships kind of revolved around that. Like I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying I have any judgment about that, but I'm just pointing out that that is a very basic level of how we can experience our sexuality. And a vast majority of people, because of the way sex is taught in our culture, or really the lack of teaching it in our culture, right? There's really not much education about it. There's an incredible incentive to have a lot of it. And every television show you watch and every commercial you see on TV and, you know, what your friends talk about and all this stuff, like there's an incredible incentive everywhere we go, and everybody wants to have sex and everybody wants to have more sex and everybody wants to have better sex. But there's not really any education about it, right? Like nobody's talking about, I shouldn't say nobody, there are people, but it's the few. The mass culture, we're not really educated on this in a way where we understand what sacred sexuality would look like, or where we understand what sex at the level or the vibrational state of love would look like. As we want to grow into a deeper experience of love and intimacy, our relationship with sexuality has to transform as well. And it can't just be about having this basic need met. So what do I mean by that? Well, I want to share a couple of personal stories. This was kind of my relationship with it. Before I say that, I want to say, like, I've always been a little bit of a romantic, right? Like I've always been a little bit of like, I mean, that's why I do the work I do. Like I've always been a little bit of a romantic. I've always wanted a loving relationship. I mean, it's something that even as a kid, I would kind of dream about, like, you know, having a wife, having a family. Like these were just, it wasn't something I was allowed to talk about with my dad, or, you know, my dad. And if you look at his relationship with women, like he wasn't the space to educate me on that or teach me anything about that. But it's something I've always kind of wanted, like in my heart. And, you know, fortunately, the older I got and the more I got into therapy and personal development work and different things, I've found great men who have been able to show me a different kind of relating and a different kind of relationship. But, you know, when I look at where I started as a teenager and then becoming an adult and starting out my relationships, as much as I was a romantic, and as much as I wanted to fall in love and have a relationship and have all those good things, and I'm just being honest about this, sex was kind of the driving factor. I found myself getting involved with people that I could have sex with. And then it was kind of like, after that, we'll see where the relationship could go, right? After we sleep together, we'll see what we could have in terms of a relationship. It was a very misguided approach, because what I found was every relationship I got into, and I mean, I'm just going to be honest about this. Like this was every relationship I was in up until I met my wife. And some of these relationships lasted more than a year. Like I thought I was in love with some of these people. Like I'm not saying that these were bad relationships. I'm not saying that they were even necessarily toxic. I mean, some of them were healthier than others. But what I'm getting at is that they were all started with sex, and that they were all based in sex, that there wasn't much more than that happening. And I started to see this pattern where I would hook up with someone, you know, and I was like, I don't think I've ever really had a one night stand in my life. Like every person that I've ever been with, I've pursued some degree of relationship with. Doesn't mean we're together forever, but I've pursued some degree of relationship with them. And what would happen is we would start sleeping together, and the nature of our relationship would be about sleeping together. And yeah, we would go on dates, we would go to the movies, we would go to the beach, we would hang out on weekends, we'd go to parties together, we'd be boyfriend, girlfriend, we'd do the whole thing. But what I experienced was that all of these things that we were doing outside of the bedroom, our relationship was not about the relationship, right? Our relationship was not about the relationship. It was about us sleeping together. And this would go on for a year. It would go on for a year and a half. It would go on for 2 years. It went on for different amounts of time with different people. But what I saw time and time again was there was this pattern that we would start sleeping together and it would be great. And we would sleep together a lot and it would be wonderful. And we would continue doing it until a certain point where that wasn't enough anymore. And maybe it's because we would start arguing about different things or there were different reasons, but we would get to a certain point where that wasn't enough to sustain our relationship anymore. And then we would have to face up to, what do we really have, right? If it's not just about sleeping together, what do we really have? And what I found time and time again was we didn't really have anything. I mean, some of these people, I really wanted to make it work. I did everything I could. I went to therapy and got coaching and did everything we could to try to make these relationships work. But at the end of the day, they weren't working out. And the reason they weren't working out was because we didn't have anything. There was nothing there other than our physical attraction to each other, other than the fact that, we wanted to hook up. That was all we really had. And that would carry us, like I said, for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years. It would carry us for a period of time. But eventually we would get to a place where there was nothing else. And I don't just think this, this isn't an opinion. I've coached people in this. I've seen this happen in real people's lives. I think I was very lucky to have gotten out of those relationships. I feel fortunate that I didn't end up with some of those people, but a lot of people get married on that basis. A lot of people have children with each other, and then they have children, and then they start raising children, and then they end up 18 years later in the relationship and they're completely separate from each other. They don't even like each other. They don't even have a relationship, and the sex died a long time ago because they were never truly intimate with each other. And once the relationship reached a point where the sex wouldn't work anymore unless the intimacy became deeper, the relationship itself died. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in today's episode, because I think that is a point that a relationship reaches where after you've been sleeping with someone for a while, the sex becomes unfulfilling unless there's a deeper emotional intimacy between you. But I'll circle back to that point. And so what I found is that time and time again, I was ending up in these relationships driven by a physical need to hook up with someone. And my criteria was basically, do I find them attractive and do I want to sleep with them? And if that was the case, then I would do it. And like I said, that would carry us for a period of months. In certain cases, it carried us for maybe a couple of years. But eventually, time and time again, I found myself in empty relationships. I found myself in relationships that just didn't have anything going on aside from our physical attraction to each other. I would love to say that I was enlightened enough to come to this realization on my own and start approaching them different, but I just wasn't, and that's just not true. And I'll say, honestly, my programming around this was really, really thick. And for the ladies who are listening today, I want to share some of this too, because for the ladies, especially who are dating or who are interested or want a relationship with a man, I think it's important that you understand that men probably have a very different history around this, that men probably have a very different belief system around this, that men probably have very different kinds of ideas about this. And I think it's important that you at least have a sense of what that is. And so this is what was going on for me. is I shared earlier that I was raised in a culture of men that it was like have sex as often as you can, as much as you can with whoever you can, every chance you get, right? And it was very much about just that physical gratification. Coming from that, and like I shared earlier, I wasn't always like that wasn't necessarily my truth, but that was my upbringing, that was my culture, and that's what was impressed upon me by my father and my uncles and my father's friends, and that's what was impressed upon me by the boys I grew up around and the peer group I was in. And so even though I wanted more than that, I didn't really have a safe space to explore that. And then on top of that, I felt this incredible need to perform. I felt like I had to be like the best. And so I would never even express, like, if I was dating a woman, I would never even express that, like, oh, well, I want to wait. Or, oh, I would like to get to know you first. Like, even if on some level, maybe I did want that, I would never say that because I was too afraid of her thinking I was some kind of simp or something like that, right? Like I was too afraid of the judgment that would come from me stepping out of that typical male role. And because of that, as I've already shared, that defined all of my relationships. And I know a lot of times I talk about this, and I recently shared some posts on Instagram where I've been talking about kind of the hormonal science with men. And if some of you haven't seen that post, I'll just share a little bit about what I said in it. Is that the male sex hormone testosterone actually blocks the production of oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. And so men, when they are operating from very high levels of testosterone, they are unlikely to form strong bonds. But the longer a man is in relationship with a woman, the longer a man gets to know a woman, his levels of testosterone actually lower, making that oxytocin, the bonding hormone, more available for him, more likely to bond. For that reason, among many other reasons that I'm probably going to talk about today, I I think it's very wise when you start dating someone, and I think this is just as true for men as it is for women. When you start dating someone, it is important to prioritize the emotional relationship over the physical relationship. Often, when I talk about this, the question comes up, and I want to address it today because I think it's an important question. The question is, why is it my responsibility? Why am I the one who has to create the boundary? Speaking as a woman, right? Like, why do I have to create the boundary? Why am I the one who has to do it? And I agree that's not fair, right? Like, I would love to see a world where men are conscious and aware enough that they come to the table saying that, hey, I want to get to know you first. Like, I would love to see that. I also know what my upbringing was like. I also know when I was dating what my insecurities were. Like I just said, I was afraid to, like, even if I felt that on some level, I was afraid to tell a woman that because I didn't want her to perceive me as some kind of simp or something like that. And so I know what the culture that men come up in around this is. And I know the limiting beliefs and the fears and the insecurities that are around it. And I also know that a lot of men, and I don't think this is all men, they have a sex drive that's kind of dominating their consciousness. And they're not going to be the one to say that because really they just want to get laid as quickly as they can. But what I experienced with my wife, she was very clear about wanting to prioritize the emotional relationship. And what I felt when she did that was actually relief. It was like, oh, thank God. Like, I can finally get to know someone without this complication, without this pressure to perform. I got to a place where I was like, oh, that feels really good. Like, yeah, that sounds great to me. Like, and it wasn't that I wasn't physically attracted to her. I was. And like, we kissed and we made out a little bit and we did things. I'm not saying we weren't physical at all, but she was really clear. She's like, look, I don't want to go there with you until I feel that we have something real, right? I don't want to go there with you until I feel that this is a relationship that is worth investing in on that level. And actually, what she was doing was she was saying, these weren't her exact words, but what she was getting at is like, if we do that together, I want that to be an expression of the relationship that we have, rather than us having a relationship that's just based on the fact that we hooked up. That was a complete reversal from everything I knew about relationships up until that point. And again, I want to say, I know that everybody's experiences are not exactly like mine. I think there are probably as many different experiences as there are people in the world. So I know not everybody's having the same experiences that I'm having. I'm just telling my story. I'm just telling what happened for me and what I learned. When my wife created that boundary, as I shared, it was like a relief. It was like, wow, that feels really good that we can just like spend time together, get to know each other. And there's not this pressure again to perform or to any of that, right? It's just like, yeah, let's just spend time. Let's just get to know each other. That felt really, really good to me. And it also framed the relationship differently for me, because now I'm looking at it like, is this somebody I really want to be with? Right? It wasn't like, oh, I hooked up with someone last week and I can't wait to hook up with them again. Like, it wasn't like that at all. It was like, oh, let me get to know this human being. And my wife and I've shared this many times, is that, we spent a weekend together. We were long distance and she was visiting South Florida where I lived. And we spent a weekend together and then she went home and we talked every single night on the phone for 3 weeks. And it was like literally just about getting to know each other. There was no expectation. There was no pressure. There was no any of that, right? It was just like, let's get to know each other. Let's talk. Let's explore. Let's see what we have. Let's see if after 3 weeks of talking to each other, if we still want to continue to talk to each other, right? It was just like a very easy, a very like clean, just simple way of like interacting with another human being. And I want to tell you, like, it was the most refreshing relational experience I had ever had. It was like, it felt safe. It felt easy. It felt warm. And I want to say too, like, what I experienced in dating was that either I would sleep with someone basically right away, like the first or second date. Or if it wasn't that, then there would be like a lot of game playing, like a lot of back and forth. Like, so what I kind of learned, what I interpreted from that is that if a woman likes me, she's going to sleep with me. And if she's playing games with me, then she's not really into me. I'm not saying that was true. I think maybe a lot of those women who were playing games actually did like me, but I just didn't know how to navigate that. I didn't know what to do with that. But my wife was the first person I ever dated who didn't do either one of those things. She didn't play games. She didn't BS me. She didn't like dodge my calls or like anything like that. Like, she was totally available. She was totally clear about like, yeah, I'm attracted to you. I like you. Like, I want to get to know you better. Like, she made it very easy to get to know her while also maintaining some really clear boundaries, while also communicating to me about the kind of relationship that she wanted to have, while also making it clear that like, if you don't want to have this kind of relationship, that's okay, but I'm not the one for you, right? Like, she was very powerful and very vulnerable at the same time. And I had just never experienced that. It was the most refreshing relational experience I had ever come across. And I was someone who dated quite a bit. Like, prior to my wife, I had quite a few long-term relationships. I had like, I was out there, I was doing it, but I had never experienced anything like that. That set the tone for the last 8 years that we've been together. I think it's important to just kind of say that because I don't think we could be where we are now if it had started any other way. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule. So maybe I shouldn't say it couldn't be. But in my experience, starting with a physical relationship clouded the relationship so much that I was not able to really figure out how I even felt about someone. Now, I want to talk a little more about how it's evolved in our relationship. And I touched on this earlier and I want to circle back to it now. As I said that in every relationship, no matter how sexual you were in the beginning, it's going to reach a point where the sexual relationship between the two of you is going to become unfulfilling unless you reach a deeper level of intimacy. So it's kind of like I've heard some other coaches talk about it like this, is like there are really two relationships happening at the same time. There's like an emotional intimacy and a physical intimacy. And they're kind of two different relationships that are happening side by side. Basically, the best way to have an enjoyable sex life, not only in the beginning, but that lasts for the rest of your lives together, is to keep the emotional intimacy a step ahead of the physical intimacy. And I know this might not be a popular opinion. Like a lot of people just want to get close to someone. We want to feel that intimacy. And look, like having sex with someone is the easiest way to do it, right? Like I did that for years. I get it. So I'm not knocking it or judging it. I totally understand it. It's the easiest way to get close to someone. You can feel amazing in a very short period of time, but ultimately it burns out. One of the biggest epidemics in long-term married couples is that they just don't have any kind of sexual relationship anymore. Or if they do, it's like 15 minutes once a week and they just check it off the list and like, that's it, right? Like, and I'm not just saying that, like, I'm not throwing it out there. There are statistics on that. You can look it up. I've coached couples. Like, I mean, I'll have a couple come to me for coaching. You know, they've been married something like 20 years or something like that. And they'll be like, yeah, we haven't had sex in the last 10 years. Or if we have, it's just like very few and far between. And it's not super connected. And it's not something we look forward to. The reason that happens is because when the emotional intimacy falls so far below the physical intimacy, there becomes a gap that's very difficult to bridge, right? Like when you've been together for years and your emotional intimacy hasn't really deepened, and maybe, you know, you work a lot and you're raising kids and you're always rushing around to this thing or the next thing or the other thing, and you know your lives are very full and you're very busy and you're doing a lot together, but your emotional intimacy hasn't really gotten much deeper. The physical intimacy in the relationship is going to reflect that. And I think in the beginning, and I think honestly, this is just evolution, right? Like we need to have sex with each other in order to perpetuate our race. If that doesn't happen, the human race is going to die out, right? So just based on evolution, there's this kind of grace period when you start getting to know someone that you can have really hot, amazing sex with them for a period of time. But that dies out. That initial rush of feeling, rush of attraction, that is not meant to last. It doesn't last forever. And if you don't have something else in place when that dies out, then your relationship is largely going to feel empty. You'll have an empty emotional relationship, and your physical relationship will be either kind of basic and unfulfilling or just not that interesting at all or not existent at all. What I want to say about this, and I said this earlier, you know, having sex with someone is literally the most physically vulnerable you can be with another person. Our culture, because we all carry shame, and this is something that in my Inspired Love program, we have a whole process around healing shame, because it really is like, again, this is a whole other podcast episode. I can't go too much into it today, but you know, shame, like all of your limiting beliefs, all of your fears, all of your doubts, all of your insecurities, all of the things you hate about yourself, all of the things that make you feel like you're not good enough, all of your ideas of it could never happen for me, or I'm hopeless, or I'm unworthy, or whatever it is, like all of this stuff stems from a sense of shame that you carry. Hey there, if you've made it this far in the episode, then I want to jump in with a special invitation for you. You've probably heard me mention Inspired Love at least once or twice on the show. And Inspired Love is my private coaching program. It's the culmination of over 15 years of healing work, and we have recently reopened the program for enrollment. Through an in-depth exploration in all 4 dimensions of human experience, that's body, mind, emotion, and spirit, the process allows you to bring balance to anxious, avoidant, or disorganized patterns, to heal and somatically release childhood trauma, to grow spiritually, and to approach intimate relationships from a healthy, emotionally regulated, and secure place. Our students commonly report that they have never seen anything quite this comprehensive. While many teachers offer courses to improve relationship skills or heal insecure attachment styles, it's rare to find something that works in all dimensions of your being. And I specifically designed the program this way because in my experience, any true healing process must address all of these elements to have any real chance of success. I know what it feels like to crave love on the deepest levels, while simultaneously feeling unworthy or hopeless around it. I know the fear of struggling in relationships and doubting they will ever work out for you. I watched my mother suffer in and out of 4 abusive marriages. I have 4 sisters and I've watched them struggle. I've been through it myself. I know that lack of love can be one of the most painful and lonely experiences, and I created this program because I know a way out of that, and I'm inspired to share it with others. Now, I don't know if this is the right thing for you or not. What I do know is it's changed the lives of so many people, and it continues to do so on a weekly basis. So if you're ready for a big change in your love life, and you're ready to get the most out of your life overall and stop wasting time, in the description below this episode, you can book a free call with another graduate of the program. She can tell you how it's changed her life and share how it might be helpful for you. If it feels right, jump in with us. If not, don't. But don't ignore this opportunity when it could make all the difference in the world for you. Go ahead, book your free intro call at the link in the description, and thanks for listening today. To whatever degree, and everybody has it in varying degrees, but shame is something that's so woven into our culture, and it's generational. Like our parents passed down the things that they're shamed about. They pass that on to us, and our teachers shame us into behaving in class, and just across the board, right? Like shame is something that is so deeply woven into our culture. It's really interesting. Sex is the most vulnerable you can actually be with someone. And yet we carry an incredible amount of shame that makes us afraid to be vulnerable, because the core fear that we all struggle with to some degree is that when somebody really sees me, when somebody really gets to know me, when somebody really finds out who I am, they're not going to like me. They're going to turn around and run, or they're going to find some fault in me that's inadequate, and they're going to lose interest, right? Like I think that's like the deepest human fear that we all have to some degree, because we all carry that on some level, while at the same time we want to have sex because biologically speaking, it's a physical need. We have found ways to have sex that are not vulnerable. I remember one couple shared this with me. What their sex life was like was that the woman, it was a married couple, man and a woman, and basically they'd been married for, I don't know, 12 years or 15 years or something like that, and they had 2 kids, and good people, like nothing wrong with them as human beings, but they just didn't have a strong intimacy in their relationship. And what they shared with me about their sex life was that the way it worked for them was when it was time to do it, however they worked that out, whatever schedule they were on or whatever, the woman would go and basically take care of herself in the room. And then when she was done, he would come in and just, give his 15 minutes and finish the job. And that was it. Like that was the extent of their physical intimacy. No judgment about that. Like I get that. I totally understand that. But that is a reflection of limited emotional intimacy, right? They had found a way to have their sex life reflect the lack of vulnerability that they shared with each other overall, where they weren't even really doing it together. She was doing it by herself, and he was just coming in and getting his 15 minutes when she was done. Again, I'm not saying that that's bad or wrong. I understand that. I totally get that. But what I am saying is that it's kind of sad that after being married to someone for so long, the person you raise your children with, the person you share every aspect of your life with, that your physical intimacy would be so limited. And even more so, that your emotional intimacy would be so limited that your physical intimacy shows up like that. And so I know I've talked a lot today about kind of mistakes I've made, or ways that it doesn't really work. And I do want to touch on what it can be like, and kind of what I've learned in my relationship with my wife over the last 8 years. I just want to start by saying that we are people who do a lot of work on ourselves, right? So we do a lot of work on ourselves, and we do a lot of work on our relationship. And I can't handle a lack of intimacy. And so I've always pushed our relationship to become more intimate. My feeling about it is like, if I'm going to be in this, I want it to be everything it can be. And if it can't be everything it can be, then I don't want to be in it. That's kind of where I come from with it. And so, we've done a lot of work on ourselves. We've done a lot of work on our relationship. There is nothing that we haven't shared with each other in terms of our fears, our insecurities, our doubts, our, like, whatever that might be. Like, there's to such a large degree. I mean, we have uncovered so much together. And look, we're 8 years in. I mean, 16 years in, or 24 years in, I think we'll be on a whole other level than where we are now. And I don't want to make it sound like we've reached the end of the road by any means. But in terms of the emotional intimacy, that has always led our relationship. And because of that, our physical intimacy has been able to reflect that. And I don't want to, give too much information here, or I think there are certain things that probably aren't appropriate for me to share here. But my wife and I, are a space for each other where we can experience anything together, from bawling our eyes out on the floor to exploring the boundaries of our sexual life, to being honest about our deepest fears and insecurities, to supporting each other in the areas of our weaknesses. And I'm not bragging when I say this. That's not my intention. My intention is not to brag about this, but because it's not even something worth bragging about. Like, it's been hard at times. It's been ugly at times. It's been very uncomfortable at times. I've often shared about how, when you're really doing the work together, you come up against these make or break points. And these make or break points are like you're kind of pushing the relationship to the edge to see if, and I don't mean to do this in any kind of destructive way, but so many people just avoid the uncomfortable things. So many people just, if it's going to upset my partner, or if it's going to make him feel bad, or if it's going to make me feel bad, or if it's like, I just don't want to go there. And so many relationships become about kind of tiptoeing around the difficult issues, the uncomfortable issues. So many relationships become about keeping a strong face, keeping a strong look, and not letting the other person see my vulnerability, not letting the other person see my weakness. And that is the death of a relationship. And it doesn't really matter if you stay together or not. Like, there are a lot of couples that have been together for 50 years, but they have no intimacy. There's been, with myself and my wife, a willingness to approach those points where our relationship might break, to go to those make or break points, to reveal ourselves in a way that what you see right now might make you want to leave me, but I'm going to reveal anyway. And in revealing that, you're going to get to make an honest choice about whether or not you really want to be with me. You see, I'm not going to keep up any kind of front or any kind of facade to make you see me in any kind of particular way. I'm going to share the truth of who I am, the fullness of who I am. And you're going to get to choose if you want to be with that person. I get it. Like, that's the scariest thing we could ever do. Because as I said earlier, I think the deepest fear we all have as human beings is that, when somebody really sees me for who I am, they're not going to want me. They're not going to love me. What I would say to that is, but what if they do? To truly have that level of intimacy in the bedroom is to also have that level of intimacy out of the bedroom. To be able to be completely vulnerable in the presence of your partner. And as I've said, sex is the most physically vulnerable thing we can ever do with another human being. To be able to go to the deepest places sexually, you have to be able to go to the deepest places emotionally, because one is a reflection of the other. I just want to talk a little bit about what sacred sexuality looks like. When I say the words sacred sexuality, a lot of people probably imagine, I don't know, you might imagine all kinds of different things, right? Like anything from tantric yogic practices to, very soft, intimate eye gazing. I mean, it might conjure different kinds of images. And what I want to say is that it doesn't look any particular kind of way. There's no one way that it looks. There's no one thing it looks like. There's a woman, her name's Miss Jaya. I recently listened to a podcast from her. Actually, my wife sent it to me, where she talks about the 4 sexual archetypes. She outlines 4 different archetypes of sexuality. Is what she calls sexual. And that's kind of like what we see in porn. If you think, like, porn is 99% just pure sexual archetype, just straight up physical act. That's it, right? Then there's energetic and sensual. So energetic and sensual is more like soft touch, eye gazing, very slow movements. There's a way of I think my wife and I both have a sensual energetic archetype to a degree. And this is a way of kind of following the energy of the moment, letting the energy of the moment move you. And there's an intuitiveness about what to do. And it's sometimes passionate kissing. It's sometimes, I mean, again, it can look a lot of different ways, but rather than being there in a purely sexual or physical way, it's more about being with the energy of the person. And it's more about following each other's energy and moving with the energy. It's usually slow. It usually lasts a long time, right? It's not like 15 minutes and I'm out. It's like, no, we're spending time together. We're looking into each other's eyes. We're touching each other very intimately. Our energy is moving together. There's a kind of guided energy, right? The third archetype is like the kink archetype, right? So that's like pushing boundaries, doing bondage, doing just kind of pushing the limits with, I mean, anything and everything. It doesn't have to look like any one kind of thing. But that's a certain archetype, right? People who want to push the boundaries, people who want to explore the limits, people who want to experience complete submission, people who want to experience complete dominance. And then the fourth archetype is what she calls the shapeshifter. And the shapeshifter is someone who can kind of move between all these different archetypes. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because I thought it was a really great perspective on what sacred sexuality can look like, because I think sacred sexuality can be all four of those archetypes. You know, a lot of us, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, like told about how I grew up with my dad, but now let me tell you about how I grew up with my mom. And my mom was very different in that respect. My mom was like super religious, like to the point of extreme, like highly, highly sexual repressed. Like I was not given any education about sex or any, like, I mean, the only thing my mom ever told me was don't do it until you're married. And like, that's literally the only thing she ever taught me about sex. My dad, on the other hand, taught me a lot about it, but probably from a very unhealthy perspective. But I say all this to say, if you grew up in some kind of Judeo-Christian culture, what we've adopted about sex has been very much good, bad, right, or wrong. Right? There are certain types of sex that are good. There are certain types of sex that are bad. And there, you know, a lot of people take it to very extreme places. And a lot of us who wanted to explore ourselves sexually, whether it was trying different types of kink or different types of things like that, we had to do it feeling that that was somehow wrong or somehow subversive or somehow naughty, versus just being like a way that we're exploring ourselves and exploring our relationships, right? So I want to clarify in this conversation that I don't think any of this is wrong, as long as it's done with consent and respect, and you know, as long as love is kind of at the core of it, right? Like I think all of it is perfectly valid. I mean, we're sexual beings, and why wouldn't, especially in the intimacy of a loving relationship with someone you trust and someone you feel safe with, why wouldn't you want to explore all your limits? Why wouldn't you want to explore? Why wouldn't you want to spend hours doing it and indulging and meeting each other's needs? I mean, that's just, it's some of the most fun, beautiful experiences you can have in this body, in this life. So I don't want to, in this conversation about sacred sexuality, I don't want to give the impression that any of it is wrong. I think it's all very good, again, as long as it's in a safe environment, as long as it's consent, as long as there's love and trust at the core of it. You can explore all these boundaries and all these limits. But again, you're only going to be able to do that if the emotional intimacy in your relationship is greater than the physical intimacy. With strangers or with people you don't know that well, or in relationships in a casual sense, the emotional vulnerability just isn't there at all. And so there's really nothing at risk. You're not really risking anything in that sense. And so, yeah, you could go to a bondage club, you could go to an orgy, you could do all of that. You can have all these experiences, but at the end of the day, you weren't really being vulnerable because you never have to see those people again. And I would say the quality of the experience is different. Whereas in those types of scenarios, while you're experiencing a lot physically, you're not really experiencing a lot of true intimacy, right? Yes, you're being exposed physically, but you're not experiencing a lot of true intimacy. And so there's a quality of what's available internally that's missing in that. And again, I know I said I'm going to say this a bunch of times today. No judgment on that. Like, if you want to do that, go do it. That might be an incredible, empowering, awakening journey for you that will lead you to something beautiful. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying to not do it. I'm saying it's not the same thing as pushing those boundaries within a deeply intimate, committed relationship. They're two distinct things, and they're two distinct experiences. And what you can experience with a partner, someone you share every aspect of your life with, someone who knows you inside and out, someone who, no matter what you do with them, you're going to wake up to them the next morning and look them in the eyes. That's a different level of vulnerability. And I've just seen this happen time and time and time and time again, is couples who don't develop that level of emotional vulnerability that is reflected in their sex lives. They don't have the deep physical intimacy that on some level we all want, right? We all crave that on some level. I think I'm gonna stop with that. I saw some questions come in. I just want to circle back and look at these questions. Just reading this comment, it's Masara says, to be honest, I told my boyfriend I don't want to have sex until he totally understands me, and I'm thankful he understood. That's awesome. Good for you. And I'm glad he understands. I just want to say this in response to that comment, and I hear a lot from women that there's a big fear that if they don't sleep with someone or they don't go there, that the person is going to lose interest or leave them. And I mean, that may happen sometimes. I'm not saying it wouldn't, but I truly think you have nothing to risk there. When you create that boundary, what you're really inviting someone into is like, hey, I want this relationship to be about more than sex. And if that person is interested in a relationship that's based on more than sex, they're going to be okay with that. And if they're not interested in a relationship that's about more than sex, then they're not going to be okay with it, but they're not what you want anyway, because you're looking for something different. Like, I really think in that respect, there's nothing to lose. Going back to what I said about vulnerability, I think one of the fears we're confronting in that is like, if I create that boundary, am I as a person enough for this person to be interested in me without having to have a sexual relationship with them, right? Like, is who I am as a person enough that they would still want that, even if I don't have a sexual relationship with them? And that's vulnerable, right? And I totally get that. Like, that is very vulnerable to say that, hey, I want you to want to get to know me more than you want to have sex with me. And I think that's amazing. Like, I think the courage to do that is incredible. And it's not always gonna go exactly the way you want it to. Like, some people just aren't on that level, and that's okay. But I truly think the more clear that you stand in that, the more likely you are to attract people who are on that level. So I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and thank you for sharing. Just going to read this comment from Leisha. She says that I think men who can lean easily into their feminine energy will, of course, want to have sex, but will also respect and honor whatever the woman is comfortable with. I experienced that with my ex. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, again, this would be a whole other podcast, but talking about men who are able to access their feminine energy. And by the way, a man accessing his feminine energy doesn't make him less of a man. It doesn't make him, weak or anything like that. I know sometimes we hear that and we misinterpret it, but the feminine energy is the empathetic energy. It's the compassionate energy. It's the understanding energy, right? The masculine energy is very agenda driven. It has a goal. It's trying to accomplish a certain result. Whereas the feminine energy is more emotional and empathetic and understanding. I truly think that both men and women, in order to have a healthy relationship, need some degree of access to the other energy. Yeah, I can be predominantly masculine and my wife can be predominantly feminine, but in order to be able to relate to each other in a healthy way, we've got to have some degree of access to that other energy, because otherwise we're just polarized and we're disconnected. Yuri Fra, which, by the way, Yuri, I remember you from when I used to be on Instagram a few months ago. So great to have you back. Thank you. Is it true that men are so sexual creatures that all of them or the majority of them cheat for that reason? Oh, that's a good question. So let me just, short answer is no. You can't say anything about all men any more than you could say anything about all women, right? Like let's just start with that. Like, every man is unique. Every woman is unique. You can't make a blanket statement that all men do this or all men do that. Do all men cheat? No, of course they don't. I've never cheated on any of my partners. Even when I was in lower level of consciousness, I still didn't do it. That was something that, actually, even my dad, who I think he probably cheated, but he actually told me that that was something not to do. So that's still a mystery to me because I don't know why he would have said that, but he did. My dad told me you really shouldn't cheat on someone you're with. But I say all that to say that, every man is unique. And I think there are men who are cheaters, like they're just unfaithful men. They're just going to do whatever they want to do. And they're going to lie, they're going to cheat, they're going to manipulate, they're going to sleep with multiple people at one time. And not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but they're going to lie to the people and lead the people to believe that they're the only one. And they're going to pretend to be building a relationship with them. Like, there are men who do that. And then there are men who don't. I think there are men who fall somewhere in between. I think there are men who end up in committed relationships and are not having their sexual needs met and validated. A common thing, and it's probably just as prevalent with women as it is with men, honestly. But I know a lot of men and a lot of women that are in committed relationships and are sexually unhappy, where the man wants to have more sex or the woman wants to have more sex. And I've known equal people on both sides of it. When you're in that situation, when you're in a committed relationship, but your sexual needs are not being met, and there's a low level of emotional intimacy in the relationship, the likelihood of that person cheating is very high because the relationship itself is not safe enough for them to vulnerably come to you and talk about, hey, my needs. I mean, that's a very vulnerable thing, right? To go to your partner and say, I have these physical sexual needs that aren't being met, and I want you to do something about that, or I want us to work on that, right? Like, that's a very vulnerable thing. And I'll just speak for myself, like, being rejected in that sense fucking sucks. Like it feels when you come to someone in such a vulnerable way and you're rejected in that sense, it feels awful, right? Like it feels really, really bad. When there's a low level of emotional intimacy and someone doesn't feel safe enough to come with that vulnerable need, and on top of the low level of emotional intimacy, the needs of physical intimacy are not being met, there's a high likelihood that that person will cheat. And that could be the man or the woman. Would men be more likely to do it? Maybe to some degree. And I think that might just be based on the fact that women overall tend to be more emotionally attuned, right? So women might be more connected to the consequences or how that would hurt someone than a man would. Again, it's hard for me to say that like it's an absolute fact, but I think there might be some degree of truth in that. But to answer your question, no, it's not true that men cheat because they're sexual creatures. Not at all. I'll say one other thing about this. When you're in the early stages of dating someone and they cheat, that person is probably just like a straight up liar. But if it happens many years into the relationship, most of the time, there is something for both partners to look at in terms of not deepening, again, their emotional intimacy with each other, in terms of not making it a priority to meet each other's physical needs, in terms of not going to those vulnerable places where they have those conversations. When it happens years in, it's usually a reflection of both people. When it happens in the early stages, it's usually just a reflection of the person who cheats. Great question, and thank you so much for asking it. Okay, this is going to be my last question today. Lori Red is asking, I wonder why I seem to connect with men that say they want a long-term relationship, but actually never want to commit. Great question. And if I had you in a coaching session, this is what I would ask you. What you're compromising with these men. And if you say nothing, wonderful. Then just keep doing what you're doing. What I find a lot of times is we say we want something. And, we're really strong out of the gate. It's like, yes, this is what I want. I'm going for it. I'm going to have it. And then as we start to encounter the natural challenges that come with it, we start to get afraid, right? We start to get afraid that, oh, well, I'm going to lose this person. Or if I do this, they might not like me. Or if I say this, or if I communicate this boundary. And I think to the degree that we avoid, like, you got to understand, we live in a vibrational universe, and this vibrational universe is always reflecting things that are of our vibration. And so if you find yourself in a pattern of attracting people who say one thing but are doing something else, then the question would be, what are you not doing that you're saying, right? Like, you're saying you want it to show up in a certain way. Well, where are you out of alignment with that? And that goes back to the question of, what are you compromising? A lot of times when we get afraid, I'll just use a simple example based on today's topic. I want a partner who prioritizes our emotional and our real, person to person relationship over our sexual relationship. But then I get involved with someone and they really want to have sex with me and I really like them. And I'm afraid that if I communicate that to them, well, then they're going to walk away or they're going to lose interest in me. And so in order to please them and in the hopes of keeping them around, I go ahead and compromise what I said I wanted in order to accommodate them. And then they leave, right? And when that happens, and for anyone who relates to this, like, I'm talking to all of you right now, when that happens, that person is reflecting your commitment to yourself, right? When you said, I want a certain thing, but then you got afraid and you compromised the thing you wanted, and then you lose that person is simply reflecting to you your own relationship with yourself, right? You're not being true to yourself, and therefore that person is not being true to you either. So I don't know how that applies to you, Lori. I don't know if that resonates, but I would say, like, look at what you're compromising. And if you say, I'm not compromising anything, this is the other thing I'll say about it. Sometimes I think the universe tests us, right? Like, when you say you want something, the universe is like, let's see how much you want it. And so sometimes the universe tests your resilience. And it's like, okay, I'm going to bring you a few challenges, right? I'm not just going to give you what you want right away, but I'm going to challenge you with some things along the way. I'm going to see how you respond to this situation. I'm going to see how you respond to that situation. I'm going to see, when this thing or that thing or the other thing shows up, I'm going to see if you really stand clear in it, or if you fall, if you falter, if you compromise, if you, all of that. So if you say, I'm not compromising anything, then what I would say is, this is your test, right? This is your opportunity to stand in the face of these men who say they want one thing and then end up wanting something else, and to practice your resilience and say, no, like, if you want something else, that's fine. You can go find something else, but I'm clear about what I want. And I do believe that life works that way. I've seen that in every aspect of my life. In every aspect of my life, I've seen that, where I want something, and yes, I work towards it, and the thing does come eventually. It always does. When you're clear about something and you have your intention focused on it, and you put the work in and you show up and you have faith and you believe and you trust the outcome and you learn from the lessons and you grow through them, it always does manifest eventually. But that whole process of everything I just described is the process of manifestation. It's like the process of sharpening your tool, right? It's the process of, like, refining yourself, clarifying the vision, developing your resilience, developing the strength and the commitment behind what you want, learning to stand for yourself in that way. And I could say that in a million different ways, but that's really the point, right? So I'd say, if you can notice something that you're compromising, we'll focus on developing the courage to not compromise anymore, right? Just, through clear, authentic, vulnerable communication, you say, I'm not compromising on that. And if you want to be with me, you're going to have to meet me where I'm at. And if you can't find anything you're compromising on, then understand this as a test of your resilience and stay true to yourself and continue navigating this. And the more clearly and strongly you do that, the more clear your vibration becomes. And I always say, like, your personal vibration is like a beacon that calls out into the universe to everything that's the reflection of it. And so the stronger that vibration becomes, the more clear that vibration becomes, the more you let go of fear and doubt and insecurity and uncertainty around all of that, and you just start to put that clear vibration out in the world, the more you do that and the stronger that vibration gets, the more it's going to call in the people, places, and things that are a reflection of that vibration. So if you're going through a test of resilience right now, just surrender to that challenge, right? Just, okay, if I'm going to go through a season of this for however long it might be, I'm just going to rise to that challenge, and I'm going to continue to strengthen my vibration in the face of whatever disappointment or challenge I might face. And I really appreciate the question. If you want to explore that more, send me a DM and I'd be happy to chat with you about it. Okay. It's great to be back. I just want to shout out for anyone who may not be aware, this is the Conscious Love Show podcast. I'll be uploading this episode and new episodes every week. So I've been off Instagram for a little while, but I'm back now. I'm going to be live streaming on Tuesdays and then uploading the episode. So if you didn't get to catch the whole thing, today we were talking about sacred sexuality and a more enlightened view of sexuality and how we can grow into that in our relationships. And if you'd like to catch the whole episode, make sure to subscribe to the Conscious Love Show podcast on all major podcast platforms. And I'll see you back here next Tuesday, everybody. Okay. Lots of love and blessings. Take care. We'll see you soon. Bye. Thanks again for checking out the show. Please subscribe on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on the most. And I would love it so much if you leave a review and tell people what you think of us. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram @TheLivingRelationship to connect more closely. And I'm grateful to be supporting you on your journey to love.